Let's keep it simple. About the title. There is a tradition in Alcoholics Anonymous that among the last words that Dr. Bob spoke to the other founder of AA, Bill W., was these: "Let us not louse this thing up. Let us keep it simple." Whether these words were spoken or not, I don't know. I do know that they sum up a great deal of the wisdom of AA. Let's keep it simple. Preface. What then is counseling? I have spent the better part of 2 hours talking to a class of counselor trainees. I have spent a lot of time explaining what counseling is not. It is not giving advice. It is not fixing people. It is not being wiser than your client. It is not being a puppeteer. It is not enabling. Finally, when the time was about gone, one trainee brought me up short. "You have spent a lot of time telling us what counseling is not," he said. "Now tell us what counseling is." Well, the answer was there, ready, even though I had not thought it through. Counseling, I said, is a process of mutual change. I'll stick with that. A non-alcoholic at an AA meeting. I was once at an open AA meeting at a treatment center where a long-term friend of mine was seeking sobriety. I was sitting with the patients rather than the visitor and was comfortably slouched down in my seat. The person chairing the meeting took me to task for sleeping, and when I told her I had slept through more AA meetings than she had attended, she challenged me to get up and speak. I did so, and while I didn't remember what I said, the occasion made an impression on my mind. It was obvious that the chairperson mistook me for an alcoholic and very likely a patient. I have always been very careful not to sail under false colors at AA meetings and to make sure everyone knows I am not an alcoholic. The longer I thought about it, the greater my responsibility seemed to be able to make my status as a non-combatant clear. Alcoholics and their families are special people. They have paid a tremendous price before they accept the label alcoholic, and to slide into their fellowship without having paid the dues strikes me as a rather cheap way to travel. An AA club once made me an honorary alcoholic, but it was all in fun, and we all knew it didn't really mean anything. I have attended many AA meetings, a privilege for which I am most grateful. When the group conscience has allowed me to do so, I have spoken to AA groups. I must always keep in mind, however, that it is only through the gracious kindness of AA that I am there at all. Any phoniness is soon detected, and if I don't play by the rules, I will lose what I consider one of my most precious gifts, the acceptance of recovering alcoholics. Doing the right thing for the wrong reason, too. I have found myself from time to time in a somewhat obtruse discussion with my son over whether it is better to do the right thing for the wrong reason than it is to do that thing at all. I like to use the example of sending blankets to earthquake victims in some remote areas of the world. Now, if I send blankets because it helps my income tax, and you send blankets because you can genuinely care about the suffering people, the results are the same, for the recipient receives the blankets. Both my blankets and your blankets keep the recipients equally warm. The difference seems to be that when I fill out my income tax forms, I have my reward. Your rewards are undoubtedly much greater. How does this relate to the illness of alcoholism? It is very simple. We often hear that people shouldn't be going to AA unless they are doing it for the right reason. They shouldn't go unless they are genuinely seeking sobriety. I submit that very few people begin to go to AA because they want sobriety. The reasons range from laying the ultimate con on one's loved ones to simply going to AA rather than going to jail. The longer we study the matter, the more convinced we are that the recovery rate of alcoholics is about the same, no matter what they feel the reason is for going to AA. I guess it all boils down to this. I would much rather have alcoholics in treatment and AA for any reason at all than to have them go out there in a gin mill seeking truth in a bottle. Sobriety is more likely to be found in AA than in a gin mill. Why is it so important? There is a very large segment of the group which deals with alcohol problems which seems to be firmly convinced that alcohol is a necessary part of our existence. They deplore the abuse of alcohol and wish that everyone could drink responsibly. In other words, like they do. They see nothing wrong with showing up for a counseling session with an alcoholic with martinis on their breath, and they think it appropriate that a meeting of alcohol counselors open with an attitude adjustment hour, which is the latest euphemism for getting smashed. They think it would be wonderful if everyone could take just enough of this drug to lose some of their inhibitions, reservations, and critical self-judgment, and not go on to abuse. One does not have to be a heavy thinker to occasionally ask oneself, why is it so important to drink? Is the world so ugly and are our associations so threatened that we must dull our perceptions just a little bit before we can enjoy ourselves? Are our joys so few and our sorrows so great that we must use a drug to deal with them? Are our resources so limited and our feelings so frightening that we must ingest a substance to help us? One would almost believe it is so. One has only to go to an AA party or to mingle with AA members after an AA meeting to find out it is not so. These recovering alcoholics are not afraid to love, to share, and to care, publicly and with no embarrassment, and without a drug. We have created complete human beings, and we don't have to add a drug to improve on our Creator's work. Another definition. The illness of alcoholism has been defined and redefined, and I suppose little will be gained by inventing a new one. I'm going to give it a whirl anyway. This definition owes a great deal to the AA definition of alcoholism, a physical allergy plus a psychological dependency. The people who wrote it are the experts, but for non-experts, the definition poses a problem. We see an allergy as something that causes sneezing, watery eyes, hives, rashes, gastrointestinal upsets, and all sorts of similar symptoms. I guess alcohol causes some of these symptoms, but it causes the same symptoms in the alcoholic and non-alcoholic alike. The symptom I see, which is unique to the alcoholic, is that alcohol does more for the alcoholic, particularly in the early stages, than it does for the non-alcoholic. This is certainly a physical reaction, but it does not fit into the layperson's definition of an allergy. I accept the second part of the AA definition with no hesitation, because alcoholism certainly involves a psychological dependency. The definition I would like to propose is this. Alcoholism is a physical overreaction combined with a psychological dependence. When we treat the alcoholic, we treat the psychological dependence. So far, we have found no way to treat the physical overreaction. If we can remove the dependence, we find that the alcoholic does not need to drink, and the physical reaction is no longer important. This may sound like oversimplification, but it's hard to oversimplify the illness of alcoholism. One of the founders of AA is quoted as saying, "Let's keep this thing simple. The closer we come to that ideal, the greater our chances for success." Making decisions. I'm always impressed with how little we know about how we arrive at decisions and how the alcoholic makes the decision to drink or not to drink. The alcoholic makes the decision to stop drinking while he or she is still drinking, and the decision to return to drinking while completely sober. It is obvious that alcohol itself has very little to do with the decision to drink or not to drink. This was called to my attention by an alcoholic who called me to say he was back on the sauce and would I come to see him. He had seemed to have a good sobriety going, but I had felt that he really hadn't grasped the spiritual nature of recovery. We talked about such matters. "I understand what you were saying," he said. "I have had a spiritual awakening of some kind or another. It has kept me sober quite a while, but now I'm drinking. I'm going to level with you. Do you remember when I was in treatment? I told you that there were several people there for the second or third time. I asked you if I thought there was a chance that a person could get sober for the second time. I remember. What did I answer? You answered that there always was a chance, but it wasn't likely as a good chance the second time around. When I asked that question, I was already thinking of drinking again, although on another level I was serious about sobriety. In our conversation, you spoke about praying. so that you wouldn't drink that day. Didn't it work? Sure, it worked. When I prayed, I didn't drink, but then somehow I decided to drink. So then I didn't pray, and I could drink. What would you tell a person like that? Incomplete grieving. I was going to entitle this chapter Incomplete Recovery, but didn't do it because it implies that recovery is something complete. Now, we know that recovery is never complete, hence the title, Incomplete Grieving. To start with, let us look at the whole matter of grieving. Grieving is necessary if a person is going to recover from a loss. Over and over in counseling, we see the results of incomplete grieving. The reasons for grieving are many, but the process must be completed if a person is going to recover. We see a lot of miserable people with unhealed psychic wounds not having completed the grieving process. Now let us turn to the alcoholic. Giving up booze or other drugs involves a real loss. It is no less than the loss of a complete system of dealing with life. What had been a way of rejoicing and a way of sorrowing, of ending pain, of evoking pain, of dealing with human relationships, and a way of not dealing with such relationships? Suddenly it's all gone. And as with any other loss, grieving becomes necessary for healing. Often, the recovering alcoholic does not experience instant joy. The void left by the sauce is still there. The alcoholic hurts, and we have taken away his or her best medicine for dealing with pain. We must be patient. Many of the drunkalogs, much of the extravagant behavior, many of the destructive relationships are ways of dealing with the pain. We must let the alcoholic grieve. In fact, we must encourage the grieving. We must be there with love and patience and caring so the alcoholic feels safe, while the feelings of loss are replaced by the feelings of gain. An alcoholic who is stalled in the middle of the grieving process is hurting indeed and may very well return to drinking to ease the pain, if for no other reason. Saying it right. At one time, a bunch of us were sitting around with the inevitable cup of coffee, and the conversation turned to a certain individual, and someone wondered how long he had been sober. I remember very well, I said, because I was the one who got him sober. A tough old recovering alcoholic was not going to let me get away with that. You didn't get him sober, and you know it. Well, let me reword my statement, I said. I helped him get sober. You still haven't got it right. I'll try again. I was around when he got sober. Now you're getting the hang of it, was the final word on the matter. The lesson is so obvious that it doesn't need to be drawn. No one knows how a person gets sober. No one knows why some get sober and some do not. We can be sure of only one thing. More will get sober if we are around than if we are not. Old-timers. We are starting to see some 40th anniversaries among the old-timers in AA, and a few are well into their 5th decade of sobriety. The person here tonight who has been the longest sober is the person who got up earliest this morning, is one of the statements you hear from the old-timers when they are recognized. That is good. That reflects the humility that keeps and has kept the old-timer sober all these years. I would, however, like to pay tribute to these old-timers. The tribute is not because of their special virtue for staying sober, but for the fact that they kept the program going. A lot of them sat in meetings where only 2 or 3 were gathered together and have seen those meetings grow and divide into groups until one can go into an AA meeting any day of the week, almost any hour of the day or night. They were the ones who swept the shabby halls, turned on the lights, made the coffee, and most of all attended every meeting. They kept the torch burning, though at times it must have seemed that the torch was dim. They were the ones who remembered the admonition, principles before personalities, and kept AA from becoming a cult. They were the ones who carried the message of spirituality and kept AA from becoming a poker-playing club where people hung out between drunks. Anyone who has seen a loved one recover through AA owes these old-timers a debt of gratitude, not because they have been around so long, but because they bridged the gap between the founders of AA and the present recovering generation. Let's give them the credit they are due. Alcohol is not the problem. Insight seems to come slowly to me, but I once heard some wisdom at an AA meeting that opened some new vistas. I cannot remember just how it was worded, but the alcoholic who was speaking led me down an interesting road. He said that for many years he had seen alcohol as the solution of his problems, and not the cause. When one examines this idea closely, a lot of things become clear. We are familiar with the litany of denial. If you were married to my wife, you'd drink too, or my job is so difficult that I must unwind at night, and a couple of drinks do that for me, or my childhood was so rotten that I have very low self-esteem, and when I drink, I feel better about myself. Most anyone in the field can add to the list endlessly. These statements all have one thing in common. They see alcohol as the solution and not as the cause. When we tell the alcoholic that we are going to take away their habitual solution for their problems, they become very frightened. Not only have they been using alcohol to deal with the usual problems of life, but they have been using it to deal with problems brought on by drinking. They see themselves as being left with problems and no solutions. We often see a person who is thoroughly disappointed after a period of sobriety. The problems of drinking are gone, but the problems of living remain. We have taken their time-tested solutions from them, and now they must find new ways to deal with the problems of living. Their change is painful, as is all change, and they need a lot of support. They need to learn other, more permanent and more adult ways of dealing with problems. It is no wonder that recovery takes so long. Character defects. Recovering alcoholics who are the members of AA spend a lot of time discussing character defects, or more properly, defects of character. Being willing to have them removed is one of the keys of the 12 suggested steps of AA, and many alcoholics find that this task occupies them for most of their sober lives. I propose that alcoholics do not have any more defects of character than do we civilians, as the little judge used to call us. I propose further that when the alcoholic is not drinking, those defects are no worse than those of the non-alcoholic. When under the influence of alcohol, those run-of-the-mill character defects expand immeasurably. Alcohol seems to be a magnifying glass through which we view the character defects of the alcoholic. Lies become damned lies, as Mark Twain would say. Thoughtlessness becomes cruelty. Self-centeredness becomes selfishness. Just plain orneriness becomes savagery. A person who wastes money can do it with others' approval in a bar. Phoniness is never so rife as during the happy hour. One of the saddest things I have ever seen is the array of cheap gifts at a high price for sale on the back bar of a gin mill. So a person can buy one's way back into the house when one's character defects have gotten blown up too big by alcohol. Just as I believe that alcoholics and non-alcoholics drink for the same reason, I believe we have pretty much the same character defects in common. I may be the first person in history to call a shot glass a magnifying glass, but that's what it is. Lonely is a sad word. The scene was in a bowling alley in a large city. It was 10 o'clock in the morning, and already a tournament was in full swing. Dozens of people were coming and going, bowling, laughing when they got a strike, complaining when they got a split, talking when they were waiting for their turn. There was a bar in the building, which was constantly surrounded by a swirl of people. A man sat at the bar with the shot and a beer in front of him. He could not have been more alone if he were on a desert island. His eyes were fixed on his drink, and he obviously had been there for a while. He was as lonely as anyone I'd ever seen. If someone were to ask me what the saddest word in our language is, my answer would be lonely. Not alone, because it is possible to be alone without being lonely. We have often heard alcoholism called the lonely illness, and those of us who have been around alcoholics for a while know what it means. No one is more estranged than the alcoholic. It seems to the alcoholic that no one really understands what is going on. The alcoholic did not get into this situation through choice. There is no solution that the alcoholic has not tried, and none of them have worked. The alcoholic lives in a society that is saturated by alcohol and is doing just exactly what this society recommends, drinking. There seems to be no way out except suicide, But it isn't quite time for that yet. There is, however, a substance available which will solve the problem temporarily, and just maybe this time he or she can use that substance constructively rather than destructively. What those lonely alcoholic needs more than anything else is for someone to sit down next to him or her and say, "Don't be lonely, I love you, and God loves you. This is a wonderful world, and I know a way for you to return to it. Come with me." We don't say it, and we can't say it, because our society simply isn't constructed this way. Wouldn't it be great if we could? The Serenity Prayer. For anyone who might have missed it, here is the prayer which has become sort of the unofficial prayer of AA. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Not only does one hear it almost at any AA meeting, but it has become sort of a talisman by which many AA members deal with crisis, which might lead them to drink. I'm not sure we are correct in calling it simply the Serenity Prayer, because serenity often comes only after we have achieved the courage and wisdom for which we pray. It's such a great prayer that we can profit by looking at it a little more closely. It is probably the wisdom which comes first, because if we don't have that wisdom, we find ourselves fighting and wasting our strength on something that simply cannot be changed, like getting older. As a quote from the Old Testament says, "The word from the Lord was rare in those days." And I often feel that way in seeking wisdom. Solomon, before he was led down the primrose path by his foreign wives, had asked only for wisdom. Once he had the wisdom, everything else fell into place. So we might very well call it the wisdom prayer. We would also call it the courage prayer, for unless we have the courage, it does no good to decide that something must be changed. But it is a great prayer, for if we have serenity, courage, and wisdom, everything will be solved eventually. I do not know who wrote this prayer originally, but I think whoever wrote it probably had all three: wisdom, courage, and serenity. Patience is faith. Never have I had such a struggle with the title of something I wanted to write. Once the title came, then the chapter wrote itself. One might even say that the title is all one needs. I tried Patience is Faith in Action, but that didn't seem to do it. I tried Patience is one of the best manifestations of faith, but somehow that is too scholarly. Patience is a form of faith, seemed empty. Finally, the answer came. Patience is faith. How simple, how perfect. Just that. Patience is faith. What more is there to say? That says it all. I have never thought of myself as a particularly patient person, but several of my associates have told me that that was one of the best lessons they learned from me, to be patient with the alcoholic. I guess our difficulty with being patient is that we see the alcoholic and those close to the alcoholic suffering terribly, and we want to fix them. We have the tools, the magic. All we want to do is hold still long enough so we can do our thing. We overlook the fact that what happens is not our thing. When the alcoholic recovers, it is through the grace of a higher power. Work through whatever conduits are available. How often do we say, "Here I am, Lord, send me," and then do not wait to be sent, but take off on our own? We must carry the message, then wait. Patience is faith. The first and the last. All of us heavy thinkers like to come up with esoteric ways to identify alcoholics. I have a way that is more esoteric than most. I sort of stumbled on it accidentally when I was doing a little research to try to determine if early drinking conditions had anything to do with alcoholism. There was nothing formal about this research. I asked several alcoholics under what conditions they started drinking. The result didn't get me anywhere, but I was impressed that, with almost no exception, they could describe their first drink, all of them, where it took place, how it tasted, what happened afterwards, and how they felt about it. Since the purpose of my research was to discover whether the first drink took place at home, with a family member, or away from home, whether it was open or surreptitious, and who gave it to them, it took a while for the message to sink in. Even if the drink had been 40 years before, they remembered it. It was very important to them. It did special things for them. They remembered every detail. Few non-alcoholics have such vivid memories of their first drink. Another fact that emerged during our talks was that they remembered their last drunk, and they remembered it with the very same clarity. Not always the last drink, because it was often hidden by a blackout. Alcohol was still very special to them, not as rewarding towards the end of their drinking careers, but still special. I am not presenting this as the final word in identifying alcoholics, but I find that it supports my theory that alcohol does more both to and for the alcoholic than the non-alcoholic. It is very special. What kind of an illness? In the considerable time that I have been privileged to be around alcoholics, I have seen countless new people come into the field. Each has a different set of misconceptions about alcoholism, and each is resolved to make a name for him or herself by solving this seemingly insolvable problem. It is dangerous to generalize in the alcoholism business, so I will discuss only one breed of cat, the behavioral scientists, and, of course, what I say will apply to only some of them. Upon observing the alcoholic, they see the symptoms of alcoholism, which are behavioral, and then reach the conclusion that behavior modification will solve the problem. After all, if the illness is behavioral, then a change of behavior will solve the problem. As a matter of fact, the illness of alcoholism is physical, psychological, and spiritual, and yet the symptoms we see are behavioral. There have been attempts to come to grips with this strange situation by taking liver biopsies, blood samples, studies of liver function, endocrine gland function, and all the rest, but none seem to yield any satisfactory results. There seems no way to come to grips with this illness through physical channels. The only practical approach for a counselor of alcoholics is to ask one question: what happens when you drink? In other words, what are your behavioral symptoms? It is easy to see how a newcomer to the field can be misled and how simple the solution seems to be. Of course, if the solution were simple, the problem would have been solved long ago. The newcomers enter the field, cut out a chosen group of alcoholics from the herd and practice their theory, find it doesn't work, and move on to bigger and better things, preferably in another field. The only problem is that they leave the field strewn with bodies. We have a professional obligation to use the best techniques available to us to help alcoholics, and do not have the right to test out some theories which, if it fails, results in death or worse for the alcoholic. As it is, we lose enough of them using the best techniques. A cane and a bottle. One day I was walking along Jackson Boulevard in Chicago. It was a bright, sunny fall day, and one could almost ignore the broken sidewalk, the shattered bottles, and the shambling derelicts, and pretend that all was well with the world. I came upon a tableau that caught my eye, and the longer I thought about it, the more important it became. I was on a noon break from a seminar attended by industry leaders who were meeting to address problems posed by employees drinking on the job. The still life that caught my eye was in stark contrast to the well-fed, well-dressed, affluent gathering at the hotel. The setting was poignant in its simplicity. There was a recessed doorway in a boarded-up building. In the doorway were two things: an empty wine bottle and a beat-up cane. It was easy to imagine the scenario. One could see the wino limping down the street, barely able to make it with the use of a cane. In the paper sack was his bottle of wine. He found the doorway, made himself comfortable, and entered the world of alcohol. Gradually, he felt the warmth of the alcohol steal through him. His aches and pains were gone, and his mind drifted. Finally, the bottle empty, he wandered away, using the booze to walk, and leaving his cane behind. Sometime, someplace, the alcohol wore off, and he found he was helpless. The corollary is simple. The alcoholic has made adjustments which enabled him or her to function in some manner. Alcohol may be a cane or a crutch, a brace or a prop, but it works after a fashion. Someplace along the line, the alcohol no longer solves those problems, and the alcoholic is helpless. I'm glad that the wino left his cane behind in the tower case. If it had been winter, he likely would have been in another doorway, just another statistic. Too much, too long. Often I have heard an alcoholic say, "I became an alcoholic because I drank too much, too long." Well, it sounds great. No one denies that the alcoholic drank too much for too long, but that isn't why they are alcoholic. They are alcoholics first, and that is the reason they drank too much, too long. I am one of the few in this business, I guess, who believes that the alcoholic is an alcoholic from the first drink, and even prior to the first drink. There is a genetic predisposition to become an alcoholic, and if that condition exists, well, there is only one prevention possible: complete abstinence. We must forget completely the idea that there is some way to prevent alcoholism by training people to drink productively. Millions have tried it and died trying. Another example of how we must change our thinking is to forget about the theory that the alcoholic crosses the line from social drinking to alcoholism. They do cross a line, but not that one. The line they cross is when the alcohol stops doing things for them and starts doing things to them. My revered guru once told me that if I would understand people, I must stop thinking logically and start thinking psychologically. He was right. Also, to understand the alcoholic, I must stop thinking logically and start thinking alcoholically. It's a challenge. Is the alcoholic an addict? My answer to the question is quite simple. I don't know. We often hear the alcoholic referred to as an addict, particularly in the literature, but the writer usually doesn't define addiction, so we really don't know. A consensus of definitions as to what addictions is goes something like this. A person has 1. A compulsion to use the substance, 2. Loss of control, 3. Continued use despite consequences, and 4. Serious trauma upon withdrawal. In my observations of alcoholics, I don't have any trouble with the first 3, nor does most anyone in the business. It is number 4 that gives me difficulty. We all know that the shakes and agitation that follow a serious drinking bout and visual and auditory hallucinations that we call the DTs that come when a heavy long-term drinker stops drinking. But I'm not sure this is the trauma we have in mind. Most heavy drinkers have hangovers and would likely argue convincingly that they constitute trauma, but we should look into the matter a little further. Most treatment centers have something they call detox, which usually lasts about 3 days. This is long enough to provide support that will in most cases prevent DTs, and usually gives the jumpy nerves and upset stomach time to settle down. However, we have all seen people who were serious boozers simply quit drinking, and after a period of toughing it out, seems as normal as most counselors. I have seen a few alcoholics who I call addicts, but I have seen very few alcoholics who I would call addicts. But I have seen a few. I guess my definition of physical overreaction plus psychological dependence works better for me than addiction. We can be thankful that we do not have to decide if the alcoholic is an addict before we can get on with the healing. The Nevers. I got this title from the AA Grapevine, but I'm going to use it in a much different way than the author did. While the original author used to say he was never able to share in his family's life completely while he was drinking, he never felt good about anything. He never made the adjustment to growing up because of his drinking and so on. I want to turn the nevers around and show how they become a strong instrument of denial. How often the counselor listens to never. I have never lost a job because of drinking. I have never beat up on my family. I have never spent more time on booze than I could afford. I never got into a fight while drinking. I was never arrested for drunk driving. I never had a hangover. I guess like most any alcoholic, by being selective, they can lay a considerable number of the nevers on us. Like some other things in counseling, we can use it productively by turning the whole thing around and ask about the evers. Did you ever drink more than you intended to? Did you ever get into trouble from drinking? Did anyone ever tell you that you were drinking too much? Did you ever try to cut down on your drinking? Did you ever do anything you were sorry for when you were drinking? In this backwards, mixed-up world of alcoholism, we find nuggets of the purest gold in the most likely places. Who would think that by dropping an N, we could change a clever mechanism of denial into a very useful counseling tool? Accept or be. I am not much on reading self-help books other than Alcoholics Anonymous, but I recently did read one that makes more sense than most. This writer was telling how he decided he did not have to control the world around him when someone told him, "You either have to accept God or be God." I like the thought. I have often said that alcohol is simply a magnifying glass that shows up the character defects of the alcoholic more clearly, and that most of us have those same effects. We just do a better job of hiding them, including me in that group. One of the character defects that causes us endless trouble is the feeling that we have to be in charge of everything that goes on around us. It takes most of our time and energy to keep other people straightened out, and there is little time for anything else. One gets the feeling that living is a giant chess game, and all the pieces are alive. No sooner are all the pieces on the correct squares than someone yells, "Fruit basket upset," and changes everyone. Everyone changes squares, leaving us all our work to do over. We really aren't responsible for keeping the world orderly. We can leave that up to God and spend time on something we can change ourselves. The most comfortable prayer I can pray when I go to bed at night is this: "God, since you are going to be up all night anyway, take charge of my world and I'll go to sleep." Roots. Sooner or later, everyone who is a student of Alcoholics Anonymous is puzzled by its seeming emergence from thin air. This is not the case. Of course, and better students than I have written about the antecedents of AA. I have been impressed, however, by the importance of the Oxford group in the forming of AA. The four absolutes of the Oxford group tell us a lot. Absolute unselfishness, absolute purity, and absolute love are the four. Somewhere along the line, the wise founders of AA decided to drop the absolute. Spiritual growth rather than spiritual perfection seems much more attainable than any absolute. Let us look at the principles of the Oxford group. 1. Surrender. 2. Self-examination. 3. Confession to another human being. 4. Making restitution. And 5. Giving without thought of return. Now, we are getting somewhere. Put this side by side with the suggested 12 steps of AA, and you could see where many of the steps came from. The 5 C's of the Oxford group give us a pretty good outline of the program of AA: confidence, confession, conviction, conversion, and continuance. There were many people and institutions that had an input into the formation of AA, but it is not hard to see how important the Oxford groups were in its genesis. Research. It is with a great deal of sadness and a feeling that I have been there before when I pick up a professional alcoholism journal and read of one more bit of research that purports to show by whatever means that alcoholics can be trained to return to controlled drinking. Usually those who do the research are new to the field and are anxious to make a name for themselves by applying their discipline to the alcoholism field. They intend to discover truths that have escaped us who have labored so long in the trenches. They want to show us that the weary, foot-slogging techniques we use are really a waste of time, and that their particular shortcut is the way to go. What is most troubling is that these are usually bright, well-trained people who have the very best intentions. They understand research and statistics, and they understand their professions. They are not dishonest, and they seem to believe their conclusions. All of these studies seem to have the same fatal flaw. They rely on self-reporting by practicing alcoholics and the alcoholic's family for their data. Now, if there is any less reliable source of data than a practicing alcoholic, it has not come to my attention. Since alcoholism is a family illness, those close to the alcoholic reflect the same behavior. Our researchers go blithely ahead, compiling and collating this data, and arrive at a new scientific truth. Usually, the conclusions are accepted by the scientific community and become embedded in the literature. A few thousand alcoholics return to drinking after having read an article of the study in their local paper. Some die drunk. Fortunately, most of them discover that there is not an easier, softer way and return to the time-tested goal of complete abstinence. The researchers don't stay in the alcoholism field too long, but move on to greener pastures. They build on their professional reputations founded with the new truth and leave disarray behind them. The alcoholism counselor has another obstacle to overcome when treating the alcoholic. The family of the alcoholic, who began to have some confidence in their recovering alcoholic, again have had their hopes dashed. The society, which likely paid for the research in the form of a grant, suffers in untold numerous ways. The ones who really suffer are the ones who die drunk because of this research. Stranger and stranger. At regular intervals, some newcomer to the business of helping alcoholics find sobriety gives an old idea a new name and promptly announces a new and brilliant method by which the alcoholic can return to social drinking. Aside from the fact that these things never work, I would suppose about here we should define social drinking. One usually describes social drinking as the way he or she drinks. I guess we can say social drinking is having 2 or 3 drinks at a party occasionally. However, one defines it, this is not what the alcoholic wants. Most alcoholics will tell you that they never want a few drinks. They wanted to reach the twilight zone as quickly as possible and to stay there if possible. As an exercise in curiosity, if for no other reason, sit down with a recovering alcoholic and describe this hypothetical situation. So we now have a pill or an implant or a method of behavior modification which will allow you to take a maximum of only 2 or 3 drinks on any given occasion. Any more, you will turn green, or put you to sleep, or simply will not have any effect on you. Would you like to return to drinking under those circumstances? Most alcoholics would laugh at the idea. One answered me this way, why would anyone want just 2 or 3 drinks? All that would do is to stir you up. If you knew that was all I could have, I would tell you to forget it. Offer the alcoholic a way to get really wiped out with no physical, social, moral, or financial consequences, and you may have yourself a customer. Offer him or her a way to have just 2 drinks and quit, and you have lost a listener. Use, misuse, and abuse. This is a tough one to get a handle on, but there seems to be something wrong with our use of the word abuse in relation to alcohol. A trip to the dictionary does not seem to help because it says that one meaning of abuse is to use wrongly, and this seems to imply that there is a way to use alcohol rightfully. The world is full of people who will try to defend the issue. They will argue forever that there is a way to use alcohol rightfully. The position seems to make sense, but let's look at it more closely. Heroin was invented to treat soldiers' disease after the Civil War, which is morphine addiction. It has been discovered to be more addictive than morphine and rarely used for medicine. While there are a few diehards that will disagree, let us say that all use of heroin is abusive. I would like to extrapolate this to all other illegal drugs and to alcohol. One of my favorite quotes is from the doctor who said, all non-medical use of drugs is abuse. Strong talk. Alcohol is a drug. If he is right, then the non-medical use of alcohol is abuse. There are still a few doctors who prescribe alcohol for their patients, but most have come to the conclusion that there are much safer drugs to do the same thing. No longer do they prescribe a little wine for your stomach's sake. Another curious phrase used in our society is recreational use of drugs. Alcohol comes to mind as the most commonly used drug for recreational purposes. But the thought freezes one's blood. Recreation equals recreation. How can a toxic substance which alters one's perception and damages one's body recreate anything or restore anything? One wonders. Diagnosis. In the wonderful world of the alcoholic, many things are upside down and backwards, and in diagnosing this illness, we are faced with one of the strangest things of all. It is much easier to diagnose alcoholism than it is to define it. I can imagine the reaction of the heavy drinker in this business. How in the world could one diagnose an illness that hasn't been described? To be perfectly honest, I don't know. Those of us who have spent a lifetime in the trenches have well given up trying to use reasons for drinking as a tool because non-alcoholics and alcoholics drink for the same reason. We cannot use quantity, ambiance, time of day, price of the booze, solitary drinking, or anything related to drinking itself as a diagnostic tool. When an alcoholic drinks to deal with the results of drinking, we have a useful tool. But when this happens, the illness is well advanced. Recently, in preparation for a court appearance, I have been reading the records of an alcoholic. I never met the person in question, but there is no doubt in my mind that this person is an alcoholic. 8 hospitalizations for drinking, arrests, fights, injuries, family problems, misunderstandings, lawsuits, all associated with alcohol. I can diagnose this person as an alcoholic, but I'm sure I could not define it to his satisfaction. All we know is that if certain things happen when a person is drinking, he or she is an alcoholic. There is a bright side, however, to the picture. We do not have to describe alcoholism to treat it. All we need to know is what happens when a person drinks. If problems occur, we can call it anything we wish and get on with the recovery. If our problem drinker finds sobriety down the road, someplace this person will stand up and say, "I am an alcoholic." Often, this is after a considerable period of recovery. Let us get on with the recovery and forget about the description. We had to quit because we couldn't stop. I have heard these words many times, but like so many things, it took a long time for the real meaning to soak in. I used to mistrust many of the slogans of AA as trite, but as I finally began to understand each one, I discovered that they are not trite or banal at all, but real, solid nuggets of wisdom. It would seem superficially that quit and stop mean the same thing, but in this case, they most assuredly do not. The difference to the alcoholic is so real and obvious that one feels patronizing to mention it at all. Maybe we should go further, however, for the non-alcoholics who might read this. The more I am around this business, it seems that we oversimplify or overcomplicate most matters. Maybe we can avoid both by defining alcoholism in this manner. An alcoholic is a person who cannot predict how much he or she will drink once they have begun. In other words, once they start, they can't stop. But they can quit. Almost every alcoholic can point out a period in their drinking career when they did quit for a week or a month or a year. Unfortunately, just quitting is so unsatisfactory that the alcoholic resumes drinking for whatever reason. Of course, alcoholics can quit. If this were not possible, all our efforts would be in vain. It does not take much wisdom to understand that the alcoholic must first quit before all the other steps in recovery are possible. All those steps together will not enable alcoholics to stop once they have begun. They must quit because they can't stop. I know of no way to say it better. A moment of truth. Sometimes we must go far afield for insight into the disease of alcoholism. In the instance of which I'll speak, my source was a recovering alcoholic who, in addition to regular attendance at AA and a splendid effort to live the 12 steps of AA, was a regular worker in the hospice of his town. I was impressed that he was able to deal repeatedly with the deaths of those to whom he came to care for, and how he returned again and again to the situation he knew would end in a loss. When I remarked that it must take more spiritual maturity than I had been able to achieve, he answered that the emotion he had to learn to deal with was fear. The way to deal with fear, he discovered, was to replace it with love. I have often felt that we cannot deal with or feel two emotions at the same time. If one is negative, the other is positive. If we experience anger, we cannot feel joy. If we experience jealousy, we cannot feel caring. If we feel free, we cannot experience generosity. The Bible speaks clearly on the subject. Perfect love casts out fear. Even though I have never been a practicing alcoholic, I seem to have the same character defects of which alcoholics speak. Most of these defects seem to be based on negative emotions. I have often tried to replace them with positive emotions, sometimes with success. Often I found it very difficult to deal with a person who had wronged me repeatedly, and I shared my problem with a recovering alcoholic. Pray for him. I can't pray for him. It would be phony. Pray for him anyway. How do you know God will see your prayer as phony? You know something? It worked. When that man died, I did not like him very well, but I loved him. Which came first? The alcoholic was describing problems he had before he found sobriety. He was telling how important it was for him to realize that he was still a very sick person, although he had over 4 years of sobriety. Then came this bombshell. I was an alcoholic long before I took the first drink. I wanted to stop him and ask him to say it again, but no one at the meeting seemed particularly impressed except me. As I listened as hard as I could, I wished for a tape recorder. I had a problem when they closed my country school, and I had to go to a larger school. I had problems with other people. I had problems in not being what I wanted to be. Then he discovered alcohol and later other drugs. Here is what the solution to my problems was. Alcohol let me be what I wanted to be. As happens so often, alcohol worked very well for him in the beginning. The rest of the story was familiar. His problems didn't go away, but were solved only temporarily. His ability to solve his problems did not develop, and his need for alcohol grew. At some point, alcohol became counterproductive and added to the problems rather than solving them even on a temporary basis. Since alcohol had worked before all the time, it must either be that those around him were not behaving properly or that somehow he had changed the way he used this magical substance. Those around him decided to leave, so when the problem continued, he decided that if he would modify his alcohol using techniques, he could solve his problems. When that too failed, he surrendered and began to solve his problems like an adult. He was an alcoholic long before he began drinking and will be an alcoholic all his life, even though he never takes another drink. Immaturity. Those of us who have known many alcoholics are impressed that they often seem extremely immature. They are immature in their way of dealing with people. They are immature in their decision-making. They are immature in the problem-solving, and they are immature in the way they feel about themselves. Our first reaction, of course, is to believe that for some reason these people have failed to mature, and because they are living in an adult world, use alcohol to cope with their immaturity. What is more natural than when a person who finds him or herself as a child in an adult world than to resort to the socially acceptable drug of alcohol as a means of coping? In this case, the answer is simple, obvious, and wrong. As has happened so often, it was an alcoholic, or rather several of them, who gave me the insight I needed. They explained that they had failed to mature because they were alcoholics rather than the other way around. When you come to know alcoholics well, you discover that their social, spiritual, psychological, and emotional growth stopped about the time they started drinking. Rather than facing and solving the adjustments and problems of maturing, they dove headfirst into the bottle. As a result, they did not develop the tools necessary for coping with adulthood and used booze as a solvent for their problems. A complicating factor is one that we discussed so often. The booze not only stopped solving problems, it caused many others, leaving the alcoholic with two sets of unsolved problems, the problems of living and the problems caused by drinking. With limited living skills, the answer to them is to dive more deeply into the bottle. When the alcoholic finally finds sobriety, we must not be surprised that we are dealing with a case of arrested development. The change is not to take place overnight. We must be patient. To the admonition from the Big Book of AA, spiritual growth rather than spiritual perfection should be our goal. We must add social, psychological, and emotional growth. It will come. Psychotic or alcoholic. If one stays in the business long enough, there arises a situation which is frightening, to say the least. As we watch the sufferer withdraw from alcohol, something goes wrong. The honeymoon stage of recovery does not set it, and a careful observer will discover that the alcoholic is scared to death. Often at this stage, the alcoholic goes back to drinking, and the emerging signs that something else is wrong seem to disappear. But when the alcoholic does not go back to drinking, we note some strange things. He or she may become withdrawn, may spend long periods of time alone, may exhibit hostile or disruptive behavior, may show signs of what can only be described as paranoia and talk about suicide, and in general, doesn't seem to be progressing towards a comfortable sobriety. I do not believe even the most experienced counselor should try to make a diagnosis other than that something is more assuredly wrong. At this juncture, every effort should be made to obtain an evaluation by a competent psychiatrist or psychologist. One should continue the efforts to help the sufferer recover from alcoholism, but should also cooperate in every way possible with whatever recovery the other professionals may suggest. What is going on? What has come to be known as dual diagnosis, I have noticed happens most often when the alcoholic quits drinking on his or her own and does not attend AA or other support groups. I support that one of two things may have happened here. Either the person has been psychotic all along and was using alcohol as a tranquilizer to treat the illness, or the stress of withdrawal without support precipitates the psychosis. I'll let the experts sort this out, but I know we counselors have to do something. We must be as supportive as possible and continue to do our job while other professionals do theirs. Too often, this condition leads to violence towards others, suicide, or untold suffering to many. We must be aware of what is going on if we would help. I want to be different. I have heard at several AA meetings. I've heard it so many times, but it did not really sink in until I heard the same statement by 3 people at the same meeting. Each told the same story. Each had come to AA. Each had been impressed by what was said. Each thought that what was going on was just fine for the other people attending the meeting, but they didn't want it to apply to them. They wanted it to be different. They wanted to be one of those individuals who could be controlled, who could do controlled drinking. They did not want to give up drinking. They just wanted to get rid of the bad time and keep the good times. The time of continued drinking was different for each of them, but they kept getting into trouble, coming back to AA, deciding that they were somehow different, but they kept getting into trouble, coming back to AA, deciding that they were somehow different, and then going out to try it again. Their periods of sobriety were of different lengths, but the key to their sobriety was the same. They decided they were not different, that they were indeed alcoholics, and that they belonged in AA. One can imagine how their listening changed. No longer would they say to themselves, "I'm not as bad as that guy." No longer would they search for reasons to prove that they were different. Instead, they would begin what we might call constructive listening rather than defensive listening. The result was sobriety. Somebody is responsible. The alcoholic had been sober for 10 years and was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, which is a lay term for being unable to cope. His face was familiar in many AA meetings. He had been instrumental in helping many other alcoholics find sobriety. Now he was disturbed, scared, and whipped. Like the Apostle Paul, the thing he would not do, he did, and the thing he would do, he did not do. "I have really come to dislike myself," he said. "I use people, I manipulate people, I play games, I'm phony." His pain was real, and so were his tears. "I guess right now is the first time I've been honest in 10 years. Slowly, painfully, we went through the problem. It was not too long until the answer was plain to both of us. He had never gotten past the first steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, and there was considerable doubt that he had ever taken that first step. He was a person to whom things came easily. He was always a winner. He had succeeded at everything he had ever tried, except mastering his alcoholism. He kept a reservation in the back of his mind that somehow, some way, he could work it out in his head, not his heart. After watching him hurting for a considerable time, I was about to ask him what he was going to do. He answered the questions before I asked it. "I guess I better get to work on the program," he said. "That's just what the psychologist told me to do the other day after listening for about 10 minutes. "Why, psychologist?" Trust me, among the things we used to know for sure that we are not so sure about anymore is the truism that only one alcoholic can help another. However, one of my role models was a non-alcoholic doctor who came very early to the field. When asked how he, a non-alcoholic, could help alcoholics to find sobriety, he had a ready answer. "Well," he would growl, "I never had a baby either, but I sure delivered a lot of them." There is a germ of truth in this truism. It is easier for one alcoholic to help another than for a non-alcoholic to do so. They are quicker to establish rapport because the alcoholic cannot take the position that unless you have suffered as he or she has, you do not really understand. It takes away one more tool of denial. There is more to the matter than this, however. The key seems to be in the picture that hangs in every AA club room. There is an emaciated man sitting on the edge of a rumpled bed, and two men are talking to him. What are they saying? They are telling him how it was with them. They are not laying a drunkalogue on him. They are not telling him what he must do. They are revealing themselves to him. They are letting the still suffering alcoholic see that they too hurt and are afraid. For a moment, they are dropping the pretense that we all carry around with us, that we have it all together and do not need anything from anybody. The Greek poet Homer is reputed to have said, "If I would see you cry, you must first see me cry." If we expect others to trust us with their hurts and fears, we must first let them know that we too hurt and are afraid. This exercise in self-revelation does not come easily. It requires a considerable amount of moral and spiritual maturity to feel secure enough to let others know we are not perfect. It seems to me that the alcoholic who is successful in helping another is often a person who had been through the fire him or herself and has emerged with much of the dross burned away. Also, to achieve a contented, lasting, and productive sobriety, the alcoholic must achieve a working relationship with a higher power. It seems to me that having been through the crucible of pain that is alcoholism and having had a spiritual awakening as a result of the 12 suggested steps of AA, the recovering alcoholic has the strength to do the self-revelation and hence is often successful in carrying the message. There is a lesson here for the non-alcoholic who would help the alcoholic. It is so obvious that it does not have to be repeated, just learned.